For the first time all series, we're down to single digits. The number 9 player in my 50 most relevant, the franchise, the desired for intimate one, the hyphen himself, the Port Adelaide marquee star, Jason Horne-Francis is who we are talking about on today's episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me on the podcast, we had to get as close to the source as we could, not because they're mates, but because we're going to Adelaide. He is the host and the founder of the Keeper League podcast and one of my favourite people to talk fantasy footy with. It's Heff. Hello, mate. How are you? Talking about another part of the pair and a fascinating player for fantasy footy coaches to consider.
Hey, mate. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on the show once again. I do actually live about 9 minutes from Alberton Oval, and there was actually I copped a message today asking me if I wanted to go down to the Port Club and the precinct it's called these days, and have lunch and watch training, but politely declined. Had a few other things to do, but could have seen this guy running around today. But no, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Let's talk about the Hornet coming in with a new positional allocation in 2025. He has been forward eligible for us before, but he's back yet again this season. He's coming in off a seasonal average of 89.5 in AFL Fantasy, meaning in that format, he's going to be priced just over the 900,000 marker. So too in Dream Team. While for super coaches, an average of 99.7 means he'll set you back 537,000. At his peak, and when he is flying, this is one of the most exhilarating and exciting players to watch football. You don't need to be a Port Adelaide fan to appreciate his brilliance. He is powerful. He is explosive. He is hard-edged. He is an inside midfielder that if the ball is in dispute, you're backing him in to, if he's not winning it, make it a very difficult task for the opposition team to be able to extract that ball. And then when he finds time inside forward 50, he's one of the most challenging matchups with both speed, power, and athleticism. Heff, I can only imagine from a Port Adelaide perspective how just thrilling it must be. But in a pure football sense, this is one of the best players in the league, full stop, let alone best young players.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you think back to when he got drafted to North Melbourne and just the hype was going around him. And then you kind of had an inkling just through being, living in the area in Port Adelaide, enough people and, stuff like that, that you kind of knew there was an inkling that he was going to be coming back at some stage. We probably didn't expect it after year one or whatever. But when he announced that he wanted to come back, and the fact that we got him for like what's going to look like, it's 2 first rounders and whatnot, but like it's going to look like an absolute steal for the player he's going to turn into. Really, someone who in reality you really should have to on trade another number 1 draft pick back to actually get him. But to get him the way we did, to have him, it's as a supporter, you really get that sense of generational player, and not just for Port Adelaide. You get that sense of generational player for the whole competition. Whether that translates to fantasy and Supercoach, we'll chat about that a bit more. But just watching him and the way he can change a game, or if you need something, you can send him into your forward line, and opposition really just shit themselves when he goes up there because he's such a powerful player. He's a special player to have, that's for sure.
Yeah, he is. Last year, top 10 in the league for score involvements per game. So not only is he winning the football, but he is doing it in moments that ultimately translate to scoreboard impacts for Port Adelaide. And then he's top 20 in the league per game for centre clearances, for inside 50s, clearances just in general. Like, this guy is a inside bull who then has the skill set and the supporting cast around him to be able to turn this into moments of scoreboard connection for Port Adelaide. Last year, the 6 AFL Fantasy tons last year, just the one over the 120. And it's a decent one. A 141 is his career high score across the formats. And he did that against Melbourne in August last year. So he's got some scoring about him without any doubt. There is a little bit of a basement that is there with 7 scores under 80, 2 under 60. I do want to get your thoughts, Heff, in a moment about how he could and will he eliminate some of these poorer basement scores in a moment. But based on who's available for us, he's 3rd in AFL Fantasy for points of forwards and 2nd by average, while in Supercoach, very, very similar rankings for points and by average, but a 99.7 was the seasonal average. 9 tons, a better conversion rate of hundreds to 120s with 4 over 120, including a 132 and that 141. And not as many low scores, just the 3 scores last year under 80 as opposed to the 7 in fantasy. But there is a 46 it's like 80% time on ground. So it's not like he's just fallen out and got injured. Like he's playing through the game. So I got a ton of questions, Heff, I want to ask you and get your perspective on. I think the first is there's not a great basement here to deal with. And then the ceiling's not as high to protect that scoring. Where and can you see a pathway moving forward for Jason Horne-Francis to elevate that basement? Let's not even worry about the ceiling yet. Just how do you forecast, and do you forecast that to elevate at all?
There's a few things here. So there's a few things that we need to think about. So first thing I reckon last year was Port Adelaide's forward line was a little dysfunctional, you know. We finished second on the ladder, which is pretty crazy. Consider if you look at the way we played, it wasn't the best football, I don't think, of teams going into finals. And in fact, it was probably some of the worst football in terms of form and the way we play of any team going into finals, I think, looking back, which probably explains some of the results, and pretty remarkable to get as far as we did, really. But there's a few factors. So the forward line is the big thing, I think, being like we would more often win by holding teams off than putting them away, if you know what I mean. You know, we'd scrap for a goal and then work super hard to block out the other side. So that's kind of how we played over the last probably 8 or 9 years under Ken Hinkley at the moment. So yeah, that's kind of one of the issues. So the forward line, we were forced to throw Horne-Francis forward so often. If you look at his CBA numbers, like the first half of the year, you'd regularly see like high 60s, some in the 70s. I think that one you talked about 80% in round 14. But if you look at the latter half of the season, you got a lot in the 30s and a lot of the 40s. And I think it was kind of Jason Horne-Francis was a bit of a cheat code to chuck forward a bit more. And there was a few games where he would kick like match-winning goals or close to, like games that will put us in, you know, commanding positions and stuff like that. And he would be responsible for that. So like that's one of the factors, is that we probably need him forward. Now, in terms of paths forward, so let's have a look at Port's forward line this year. It's really something we've addressed in the off-season as well. Brought in Joe Berry, brought in Jack Lukosius, brought in Richards as well. So, like, we're going to have to fit those guys in. But at the same time, you've got Dixon, who's obviously going to come out. You've got Marshall, who's done his Achilles. He's going to have to come out as well. But I think they're very different to the style of players, obviously. They're key forwards. It's just more so personnel, 3 in, 2 out type thing. But I think that we are not going to go. I don't think that's as much of an issue because I don't think Port are aiming to go as tall this year. From just a few bits and pieces I've heard, it's going to be very much more like just a change of the game plan, essentially, where it's going to be more about getting, like, a lot of the teams in the competition kind of trend towards that small forward attack anyway. And I think Port might be kind of transitioning towards something a bit similar this season. So that depends. Like, Horne-Francis still fits into that attacking kind of mold, but it is, will we rely on these 2 or 3 younger guys that we've got in to kind of play that role and leave him in the midfield more, or will we still kind of use him up forward as that kind of get out of jail card when we need to? So that's one of the factors. Do you want me to keep going on some of the other stuff? Or?
Yeah, please.
The other thing is I guess he talks about this himself, and I think there was an interview that came out just yesterday or the day before, which was perfect timing for when we're recording this podcast. Ken Hinkley wants him to be a full-time midfielder. That came out in the Adelaide media yesterday. You probably saw it around the country. But then he replied with, "I'm not fit enough to be a full-time midfielder," as well. So interesting time. So, you know, I've been out of training once or twice this year. He looks fit enough to me, but that's his words. I do know that there's a lot of Port Adelaide very, very hesitant to give any hint away about the way that they're going to play this year. Which I've found Ken Hinkley has generally been one of the more open coaches. And he likes to give away lots to the media, and he's everyone's favorite. You know, the media love him because he helps them out with their jobs, really. He's the kind of coach that announces who's debuting 3 days before it happens and all that sort of stuff. There seems to be a bit of a change in that, I think, this year. They're keeping a few things under wraps, I reckon, and I know they were a bit concerned how a few people got into training the other day. It doesn't help that the bar at the footy club is on a balcony that overlooks the oval, and that's open all the time kind of thing. But they're trying to close the sessions up a bit more and that sort of stuff. Just a few things like that I've noticed. So, what I'm trying to say is what's said in the media doesn't always mean what's going to happen come game day. So that's the thing. You got to choose who you trust. Do you trust Ken Hinkley, who says he wants to play him in the midfield, or do you trust Horne-Francis himself? He says he's not fit enough to play in the midfield and wants to play forward more. Jury's still out, but that's just something to think about.
Yeah, it's totally true. And is it forward by necessity last year as opposed to now forward by design? Are totally different outcomes that sit there. And so I'm like you, I'm fascinated with that. And I agree. I think there is going to be a significant ball movement change in Port Adelaide. I think a large portion of that is the person that was so influential to their ball movement is now no longer a part of that team in a Dan Houston. And so replicating an all-Australian player of his quality, as good as they might have options that can plug into that spot, they're just not Dan Houston. They're just not his ability. And so something will change. Exactly what that is, we'll watch with great interest and fascination through the preseason. Whether they give elements of that away or not, we'll wait and see. But that could open up, again, a share of the ball, should we see them move the ball more through the midfield rather than a slingshot approach off halfback.
I think the other thing to think about, who I think is more pivotal for Port's movement of the ball, and that's the loss of Charlie Dixon.
Yeah.
Hear me out on this one. But our whole attack was built on bombing it on that guy's head, him bringing it to ground, and then hopefully the smalls can go to work. We don't have that monster key forward anymore, so naturally our movement going inside 50 is going to have to change. And, last year, Port went out the greatest fantasy scorers, but it was a lot of kick in, it comes back out again, take the mark across, the halfback line or across the wing where our halfbacks would actually push up to, and then go again. I've got a feeling this year the ball movement's going to be a lot quicker, a lot more targeted going into defence. There might be a lot more risk involved as well. They might be a bit more happy to let the ball come out of defence a bit more too. Out of their forward line a bit more too. They were very conscious of locking it into the forward because the whole mantra is repeat entries equal goals,
yes.
Which didn't quite happen for Port Adelaide, but that was the plan. I think they might go away from that a little bit as well. It might be a bit more sit back, defend, slingshot style as well, which can sometimes stifle fantasy scoring for a team overall, just because you're moving the ball so quickly. You're not stuffing around with it. You're not kicking it sideways like St Kilda do. You're not letting the other team, or you're not trying to possess it as much as you can and chip it around and wait for the right time to attack. You're just getting it and you're going as fast as you possibly can. That might change things up a little bit as well at Port Adelaide if we do see them move towards this style, which I got a feeling that we might.
Yeah, that the good news for Jason Horne-Francis is that probably plays to his strengths too, who's not an accumulator. That might end up seeing some cutting of the ceiling of a Butters or a Rosie or some of those rebound run and carry players. But Horne-Francis at his best is see ball, get ball, and get the darn thing inside forward 50 as quick as we can. And so if there's a version or an element of that mantra that echoes what he is, I don't see too much of a drop away of his scoring. Like you look at just the AFL fantasy market share, he's down at 5.7, whereas you've got a Butters, a Rosie, the now departed Dan Houston from the team, all 6 and over, and then it's Wines at a 5.9. So it's a very low in terms of overall team scoring when you contrast where they finished on the ladder. And then Horne-Francis doesn't exactly have a high market share either, Heff. So if any of those variations that you hypothesize that might happen for whatever reasons, whether it's Dixon, Houston, culmination of this is not working for us in getting into the grand final, some little variations of this all changing. I don't see that impacting the scoring basement of Horne-Francis. I think it means at worst, he's going to be what we're going to be paying for.
Yeah, I think if anything, it probably affects Port's fantasy scoring overall for the team. But it probably it plays into someone like Horne-Francis's style of play fine. But I think you might just see maybe players like Burgoyne or those halfback flankers, Houston or whoever steps into Houston role might not be like Kane Farrell or something like that. It might not be as fruitful for them as it once was. That's more my thinking. But we are talking about Horne-Francis, not in Port Adelaide as a whole.
But it does weave into it, doesn't it? And I think the hesitancy people in the community have around Horne-Francis with our forward lines, and we've had that reshaped drastically over the last couple of weeks now with Mateus Philippou out, who's a highly popular owned guy in Classic draft that affects your rankings a little bit in the lower top end and the middle end. But our structures of been challenged and questioned, unless you're like, yeah, Sanders is it, Jack Graham is it, whoever, insert name here, go it, structure can hold. So people have looked to redeploy some of that spare cash that we've had and gone, look, barring an influx of the Bontempellis, the Josh Kellys, yeah, got him into the podcast, don't worry about that. These historical guys that we've got before, we're probably looking at Horne-Francis going, he's going to be near the top of the line of our forward lines. And there's not a heap of ceiling. There is a little bit of floor that we could protect with some development. I think it'll be okay. So he's not got much upside. So people are going, do I take on the lack of upside and just go value in other positions and hope to get there? Or do I just anchor my forward line around a guy who I think is clearly going to be near the top components of it? Do you have a thought around the anchoring versus upside elements in our forward lines?
Yeah, I do. Truth be told, I have not gone near my classic or salary cap sides in either format at all this season, so I haven't even put it together yet. I've been focusing on another fantasy platform that has been that has come out in the off season and putting more time into that recently. But my thoughts are like, well, this is generally how I would go. Like someone like Horne-Francis, like in all honesty, I see maybe 5 to 10 points upside max, in a player like him. Like I reckon he's the kind of guy, and if you just look at declining midfield scoring rates and all that sort of stuff, factor in the way that Port play, that I think Port are going to play, and also that I just think the temptation to throw him forward is going to be too great. I think come certain games where we're struggling or whatever, I think if that tank has been built and who we believe in the media, I think there's going to be just certain circumstances that don't tend to him being a huge fantasy scorer, and probably for most of his career, like he always draws those comparisons to Patrick Dangerfield. And if you look at him, gun player, Brownlow medalist, whatever, big shoes to fill. He's not always been the best fantasy scorer in the league. He's always been that kind of 90 to 100, barring like a couple seasons in there where, Brownlow year and stuff like that, where he's kind of, reached those heights and stuff like that. But especially later on in his career, he's been a bit lower in the way he kind of plays. And I think the way he kind of plays is going to be he's going to be similar to the way Horne-Francis plays as well. So I don't think he's going to be that huge scorer. In terms of what I do in terms of fantasy, like I would usually avoid a player like that. Like if a player doesn't have upside, in terms of like, for me, it's all about cash generation. If I don't think he's going to make a huge number of cash for me, then he's probably not someone I would choose. But that said, we're coming to a season where we have seen probably the greatest lack of forward options, in terms of like premiums, really, where he's going to be a top 3, and then it's like, if you're top 3 or 4 player, and if you don't start him in there, like it's who else are you going to go that you actually have confidence in? Like that's it. There will be players that do jump out and do have a huge, increase in price and stuff like that. But finding them is the hardest part. It's sometimes the safest option, I think, to go someone like Horne-Francis. You've got Bailey Smith. You've got Dylan Moore in there as well that are kind of I would probably say slightly safer guys to go with. And do you want to go with 3 premium options in your forward line? That's the question for the coach out there, and whether you can make that up somewhere else. But like for me, he's like right on the edge of like what I'll do. And when I get round to making my classic team, I'll actually have to look at how everything fits in and stuff like that. But for me, he's right on the edge of a player that I would go with. This year I could make a case, but traditionally I probably wouldn't go with a player like him. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think if you're going to get him, it's because of a number of those variables. And then also you can see a pathway early on in the year where he's likely to be at his best scoring elements, either from a fitness perspective and or a fixture element. And you put those things together and go, yeah, he might be a 95 guy in AFL Fantasy. He might be a 105 guy in SuperCoach. But if over the first 6 to 8 weeks of the year, he can be closer to a 105 guy in fantasy and a 110, 115 guy in Supercoach, well, now you've inherited that strong scoring element. And all of a sudden, those scores kind of don't matter as much while everyone else is chasing on. From a fixture perspective, Ports is pretty nice. They've got Collingwood to start the season, so no early bye for them. Then Richmond, they're probably of all the teams, I'm the one most confident positionally across the lines to say the scoring trend against is going to hold, if not improve for the coming season. So having that in round 2 at Adelaide Oval is juicy. Then they're back at Marvel, back in Melbourne, should I say, against Essendon, St Kilda. A little tougher game against the Hawks and the Swans. And then round 7, it's North Melbourne, round 8, the Bulldogs. So there are some favourable matchups there early for us, Heff, but I think with Horne-Francis, you can see what you want to see and you can choose your own adventure. You can go, I'm going to anchor to a top line option. I can see a few matchups early that I like. And I believe that now the acquisitions of a Lukosius and a Berry mean he is deployed forward by need, not by design. I'm happy. Or you can take the other view, which is he scores well, but he doesn't have a freakish ceiling and his basement still keeps him in limbo enough. That means while he might hurt me with a 130 next week, he'll be down at a 70 and it levels it out. I still feel like once my cash generation has popped a little bit more, I'll be able to get him for a comparable price point, but I won't feel like I'm reaching for a guy that's just what he is. I think both set of coaches in a classic feel pretty warranted about their viewpoints around starting or upgrading to Horne-Francis.
Yeah, I do agree with all of that. Admittedly, I haven't even looked in the fixture, but that is good news to kind of hear there is some favourable matchups in there. I think Supercoach is probably a bit of a different question though as well. Like I think with the extra 10 points there, he's priced at like you can kind of expect that 100 each week. I think it's probably more of a, for me, just the way he plays, I think lends himself to Supercoach a bit more as well. So it's probably a safer option there, which is worth noting for the Supercoach players out there. And my perspective is generally from an AFL fantasy perspective because I have only played Supercoach for one season. But so that's I do agree with pretty much all of that. He's just right on the edge for me. It's I'm gonna have to kind of have a look at what my whole team looks like, whether I've got enough good forward mid-price options, which is looking like there was quite a few like an injury this week kind of hampered one of those, and got to think about a restructure there. But that might actually make the way of maybe going up to a Primo or going up to Horne-Francis anyway from there, and kind of finding someone else back in the back lines or in the midfield or something like that as well. You could even probably save money in the ruck. Did you hear some of the rumours about the rucks today? But anyway,
not true.
Yeah, you might even be able to save a bit of money in the ruck. Thankfully, might be able to save a bit of money with a cheaper ruckman, given Rowan Marshall's news and stuff like that as well.
Yeah,
you can put that money into putting into Horne-Francis and starting those 3 or 2 of those big forwards anyway.
Yeah, it's true. Look, if I was paying up in any format to start Horne-Francis, it would be Supercoach over the others. But I can see a very compelling world where there's no necessity to go there unless you're convinced he's going 110 plus over that first 4 to 6 weeks. If you don't believe that, then it's probably best to go look for the value options that do exist and go there. But if I'm starting him anywhere at Supercoach, I feel like there are better F1 options in Fantasy and Dream Team that could match what he does, and doing that at a cheaper price point. But on draft, it doesn't matter price points. It doesn't matter upgrade cadence. It's all about what you do on draft day, where, again, it's going to probably be different to a degree on the format you're drafting, whether you're drafting on the Keeper platform, which is where not only the Coaches Panel, but the Keeper League choose to podcast in 2025, or you can choose to draft in a Supercoach scoring platform as well. But where do you see him going on draft day? He's going to be someone's F1, undoubtedly. Where do you see him departing draft boards?
Funnily enough, I was asked this on the Supercoach podcast the other week with Al and Dos, having never played a Supercoach draft before in my life. So I said I'd probably take him in the 3rd round in a Supercoach draft. And, it'll probably be the same in the AFL Fantasy, to be honest. Once you've kind of locked in a Primo mid, you have a look at any of those kind of big dog rucks that are there, doubtful at that stage. I tend to go towards like another Primo mid if I can get it, because like if you're going down to forward line to a 90 and 95 guy, you could still be potentially getting like a 105 guy, depending what order in the draft you've got in the 2nd round. So, or at least like a guaranteed 100 plus guy anyway, and you're giving up points there. So for me, that's when I'd probably start to look in the 3rd round. In one of my single season draft leagues last year, I went early on a forward last year, and in all honesty, it probably cost me the season. I ended up finishing 3rd. But the lack of points I gave up by, I can't remember who it was, but I think the lack of points I gave up by just not going the safe midfield pick probably was enough to cost me kind of a top 2 spot, double chance, and every chance of winning the flag type thing, or at least making the grand final. So I would accept a 3rd round pick, probably in both formats. The thing is, like, you look at the forward lines, and every league is going to have that guy that thinks I'm going to need a top dog forward before they all go off the board. Yeah. And he's probably going to go in most of the second rounds. And that's fine as well. Like, and I don't think it's a bad pick. It's, if you take it in the second round, it's just probably not what I would do. I would probably just take the upside of another mid. Yep. And again, it always depends on how your draft unfolds, but that's the way I'd approach it.
Yeah, it's true. And of course, the league size in terms of who's on field, well, now positional scarcity becomes a huge factor. If you're drafting a 5-7-1-5 of 5 defenders and forwards, 7 mids, 1 ruck, well, forwards aren't as scarce as they might become as, so a 3-4-1-3 league, where now it's like, whether the depth of mids is massive, but it falls off in the forward. So these factors, the number of coaches, they all sit in there. He's a tier 1 forward. He's going to be one of, if not the first forward that goes off the board, regardless of the platform and scoring format that you go for. But I agree. I think first round is way too hard of a reach. Someone will probably jump in the second round, just trying to lock who they think is the best forward. And then, if he's sitting there in the third because people are locking away other spots, take it, because he won't last much longer if it happens to do that. Hey, mate, always an absolute pleasure talking to you about fantasy footy, and always appreciate your insights around fantasy football, and certainly on today's episode around a Port Adelaide superstar. The Keeper League, the podcast and the video content that you run, it's got a website. It's got a brand new SuperCoach mock draft simulator as well. Tell us about what you've been cooking for us in the pre-season and where we can keep in touch with you.
Yeah, trying to go a bit harder at the SuperCoach resources. I always had the SuperCoach spreadsheet, which had it was just lots of stats that help people do their rankings. Put that out, but I've kind of gone a bit further this year. I don't know if you heard earlier, we put out community draft rankings for the first time ever. It's just a kind of simple little app that runs on the Keeper League website, where you get served 3 players, and you've got to choose out of those 3 players which you would pick first in a Keeper League draft. So we started that for AFL Fantasy, and there's a bit of a ranking system that goes on behind the scenes, and over time, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of users kind of using it, it ranks all the players in what the general community thinks should be done. So there's a SuperCoach version of that, and that kind of stems into the mock draft simulator, because I've kind of used the basis of those ranks for the mock draft simulator, basing on those ranks. So right now, if you draft, you're going to draft against those ranks. But because I only launched it yesterday, so as more people kind of draft, it'll update more and more, and then you'll be kind of thinking about, you'll be drafting against, guess what the general community does in a draft situation as well. So it's I think there's another one out there right now, but it's like one of the few draft simulators that actually factors in Keeper League players, and it goes pretty much it's all based on what other users do in certain situations, and that's how it kind of works. So got a AFL Fantasy version of everything as always, but the SuperCoach version of those 3 things, the mock draft simulator, the community rankings, and also the ultimate spreadsheet, I call it. They're all up on the website now for SuperCoach users as well.
That's fantastic. Hey, if you missed any of those great tools, we've actually put them and the links in the description of this episode too, so you can go and check it out. If you also want to get in touch with Heff, all those details are in the description of the episode. Some incredible draft content, whether it's keeper focused, no matter the scoring format you like, there's always some great gold that Heff has been delivering for a long time in the community. So appreciate the pioneering work you've done, my friend. And it's an absolute resource that if you're a draft coach, you want to get on that. Hey, if you're loving this series of the 50 most relevant, we have got about a week left to go. Can you believe it? This year feels like it's just flown by with the 50 most relevant. Go back, and if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe to the channel and go back, check out all the other videos. Maybe now that there's an injury or a change you've made in your team, you're like, oh, this guy's an option. Go back, re-listen to the episode again. It might just open up a few new pathways. But what do you think the Hornet is going to average this year? Do you see a role change for him? Do you see a midfield or a ball movement change for Port? Comment below and let me know. And if you're listening to this as an audio podcast, give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the channel. And all the details to get in touch with us, to join our Patreon, and to actually get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch too, you can do that in the description of this episode. Do you want a clue for who's next? Let's give you one, shall we? For years, if you were drafting, almost regardless of the format, this guy was a lock to go inside the first round. It didn't matter the format. just every single year, this guy would fly off the draft board in the first round. And I think in SuperCoach, that'll absolutely happen again. But he's not getting as much love in the AFL fantasy community to the way that he should. Because we're all, for classic, hunting for where's a bit of value, where's a bit of upside at our top end. And in SuperCoaches, if you want this guy in your team, just in classic, let alone draft, I think you're just going to get what you pay for. But in AFL fantasy, I see a world where he could return back to the peak of his scoring powers, and you get a little bit of gravy on what is one of the best players in the league. Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.